How does Washington draw connections between his different ideas? In this lesson, you will learn to analyze the connections between ideas by examining the similarities between different passages. Let's review. Let's remember that Chapter 1, Up From Slavery, is an autobiography of a former slave. We're also remembering that authors write their ideas down in a specific order, such that they support their ultimate purpose in writing the text. So also remember that when you're making sense of a complex text, it's important to remember that the writer gets his or her point across not only with the denotative meaning of words, but also with the connotations of those words. So, as you examine a text closely, you need to think about all of the feelings, the multiple senses you get from the words that you encounter. Step 1. Notice two passages with different content. Step 2. Create a Venn diagram in which you brainstorm the differences and similarities between the passages. Step 3. Ask yourself, how does the author connect these seemingly different ideas? For the first step, I've selected this passage that begins with, "As a rule, not only did the members of my race entertain no feelings of bitterness against the whites before and during the war," and in this passage he goes on to explain how former slaves felt about their former masters even after they were freed. I find it helpful to jot down a summary of the paragraph on a sticky note. The second passage that I've picked out begins with the phrase, "I pity from the bottom of my heart any nation or body of people," and goes on in this passage, Washington, goes on in this passage to condemn slavery. But he also goes on to say that black people are better for having gone through slavery. So again, I'll jot down those notes on a yellow sticky note. So now I've got a summary on each of these sticky notes of the two different passages. So the next step is to take my summary and go ahead and put that onto my Venn diagram. This is how I know these two paragraphs are different. But in order to get a more nuanced view, I need to dive back into the text at least one more time. So I will get a look now at the first paragraph to see what details in it make it similar or different to the second passage. And as I read through it, the first line that stands out to me is this one about the black people tenderly caring for their former masters and mistresses who have become poor and dependent. This stands out to me because it shows that black people have more power than their former masters. They are the caretakers in this situation. So what I'm noticing is an under the surface meaning or an implied meaning rather than the surface meaning. Washington is subtly showing how powerful the black people have become, so powerful that they are in a position to help the whites rather than the other way around. He goes on even further down this path later in the passage when he writes about the one man in particular who is a poor drunk. He uses these words to refer to the young man who had become so reduced in purse and self-control by reason of drink that he is a pitiable creature. Such a description goes even further to paint a picture of white people as weak and powerless, and of black people as powerful and noble. These are very interesting details. So now I will add them into my Venn diagram. So I have again that the first paragraph, in addition to the summary, it shows that black people are powerful and they're noble. They're in a position to give help and they do it freely, whereas white people are portrayed as weak and poor and in fact. So in this second passage, I'm looking again for details that stand out. And I see here's that phrase about getting entangled in the net of slavery, and that's where I got my summary about how Washington is condemning slavery. And later on, here I see where he had said that black people are in a stronger and a more hopeful condition in all these ways. So that's again what I've already put on my Venn diagram. Um, but what else is interesting is this passage here about how no one section of our country was wholly responsible for the condition of slavery. This is interesting because Washington really is emphasizing that it's nobody's fault and that it's a difficult thing to get rid of. So there's sort of a natural implication that there should be no bitterness towards anybody. Then this is also interesting to me. Later on in that paragraph, you see how Washington explains that black people are in such a good position that they can actually return to Africa to enlighten their ancestral people who still live there. And again, he's implying that the position of black people in America is actually quite high morally. So much so that later on in the passage he goes out to say, I can have such faith in the future of my race. This is really interesting to me that he's positioning the black people with so much power, but in such a subtle way. So I take all these juicy details that I've noticed, and now I'm going to plunk them right back into my diagram. So I put down how no one is completely responsible for slavery, that it's hard to be rid of, and also the high moral position with the missionaries going back to Africa, and then also that he has great faith in the future of his race. So now as I look at all these details, I'm realizing that some of the things that I initially put down as being different between paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 are actually quite similar. So look at on paragraph 1, there's this detail about black people being powerful and noble. So that can move towards the center, because you see over here in paragraph 2 the detail about them being in a high moral position. That's really very similar to the idea of them being powerful and noble. So I'll take these ideas and re-summarize them in the center of my Venn diagram, as black people are now powerful, noble. They have a high moral position. Oof, that's a lot of good work. So now let's remember that the final step is to ask yourself, how does the author connect these seemingly different ideas? In this case, the seemingly different ideas were on the one hand that the black people love and are loyal to white people, and on the other hand that slavery is evil, and that black people are better for having gone through it. So how does Washington connect them? With the common thread that black people are more powerful than white, that they have high moral position. So this leads us back to the original text-dependent question, how does Washington draw connections between his different ideas? But don't worry, we've already done all the hard work, so all I need to do is use the question to frame my response, and calling on my notes and diagram, I can answer my question thoroughly. Here we go. Washington draws connections between his different ideas by hinting and implying at common themes. For example, in these two paragraphs, Washington shows how black people are powerful, noble, and on high moral ground. He shows the former with examples of former slaves helping their former masters out of the goodness of their hearts, and he shows the latter with the example of former slaves going back to Africa as missionaries. So, we noticed two passages with different content. We created a Venn diagram in which we brainstormed the differences and the similarities between the passages. And we asked ourselves, how does the author connect these seemingly different ideas? In this lesson, you have learned to analyze the connections between ideas by examining the similarities between different passages.